Hello again, welcome back. I took a pretty long hiatus there, but I've been meaning to get back to this for a while. Yeah, so for today's video, we're going to focus in on Mezcal, and we're going to do very deliberate tasting like I mentioned in the previous video. I really want to focus in on the three main still types that get used in Oaxaca specifically, and see if, maybe we could parse out some differences to see how that aspect of the production method might result in the differences in how the things that you're tasting in your glass. So in order to do that, it's difficult for me with my collection. You want to control for as many factors as possible. Unfortunately, I don't, when it comes to like agave varietals, for example, I don't have enough bottles where it's one type of agave across different producers. So I try to get it as close as I possibly could so I could at least control in this test for one factor. So tonight we're going to drink all Karwinskis. In case anybody doesn't know, it's a species of agave. They look pretty unique in the agave world. They're a little more palm-like. I actually can show you real quick. And you can see all the different types of agaves. Wildly different, but Karwinskis in particular, right here, are very different looking. More palm tree-like. They're more stocky, and they tend... I find them very distinctive. They do show up in the glass. The flavor characteristics of Karwinski quite a bit. I find them to be quite earthy and vegetal. I know Mezcal is like that to an extent, but Karwinski in particular, it's very vegetal, very green, and kind of has a musty kind of flavor to it, I find. So unfortunately, within Karwinskis, there are going to be subspecies. You got Major Cuishe, Baril, Tobasiche. There's tons of different names for different types of Karwinskis. Unfortunately, I don't have one subspecies that I can drink across the different still types that you see in Oaxaca, but I try to get as close as possible. So the three that we're going to be drinking, I'm pretty excited about some of these. Mezcal Dixeebe. This is from the Cortez family in Santiago Matitlan. So this is our 100% copper pot still type that you'll see in Oaxaca. Santiago Matitlan is famous for its copper pot. It's one of the biggest producing regions in Oaxaca. You generally, when you see a lot of the brands, like the major brands out there, a good chunk of them are probably coming from this area. But the Cortez family's been there for a long time, and they're one of my favorite producers. And Dixeebe is one of their new brands that they've started. The next one will be our example of Refrescadera still. Once we get into each individual one, I'll talk about the still types themselves so we can know what they're about. But this is a Refrescadera still from Jolgorio. This is El Jolgorio's Todos Santos. This is like their special one-off releases that they do every year. This one's a Tobasiche, and from Pablo Vasquez in Jolgorio. And then the next one, which you probably will struggle to find. I think they're just starting to ship into the United States. I got this right from the Palenque. It's Rambha. So this is our example of a clay pot distillate. So Rosario Angeles is the producer. She's a female producer, which is kind of cool. And Santa Catarina de Minas, which is exclusively clay pot production. And this is a Tobasiche as well. So all Karwinskis, the first one being a Cuishe, so a little bit different. We'll have a different flavor profile, I'm sure, but we're going to try to see if we can parse out the differences. So, to start, simple. The most common type of still type you'll see generally in Oaxaca will be just a straight copper pot still. So they distill it twice. Everyone's going to have their different production methods, how they cut and everything, but this is generally the easiest way to make mezcal. You get the highest yields from it. You don't lose so much, like we'll see later on with clay pot distillates. They tend to the yields are crazy low. So you get the most production out of it. You get a much cleaner profile as well. And yeah, you know what? Like everybody loves clay pots because it's the ancestral method. It's an old, what they want to say is an older production method, not necessarily. But I really like the flavor profile in copper pot. It is clean. I tend to find it a little lighter and high toned, a bit more floral and fruitier kind of characters come through, whereas I find, for example, clay pot can be a little smokier and robust. But let's see how this plays out. So yeah, this is from Valentin Cortez, Santiago Matlan, copper pot twice distilled with Cuishe. So the first thing on the nose, it's a little volatile. I find there's the high tones that I was talking about. I get a very distinctive vinegary kind of note. Dill. There is a lot of that Karwinski character though. Like one thing I often get is kind of a peanut shell kind of note. Kind of blends in with that earthy characteristic. And there's like cucumber, but like not even just like cucumber flesh, but like more of the skin and the seeds, like a little bit more kind of bitter characteristic. The smoke's there, but it's not over the top. It's a slight kind of chemically smoke note in a nice way, but much more earthy. But I do find this high tone, so like I'm not getting these like deep, rich cooked agave notes coming through so much as these brighter. The vinegars were like vinegar. I find is going to be a little bit more high toned in character, and oh yeah, lots of citrus too, lots of lime and lemon, but high tone. I'm not dealing with these kind of brooding, cooked agave notes with this one. It's honestly, this is incredible. Like when I opened this one up a while ago and first tasted it, it's probably one of the best mezcals I've had in a long time. Yeah, and on the palate, it just envelops your whole mouth, but it follows from the nose. Like there's a bit more smoke on the palate, but lots of vegetal notes, celery, cucumber. Yeah, the smoke kind of lingers a little bit longer, but I still find the vegetal notes pretty dominant. There's a little bit of kind of dill, eucalyptus kind of notes as well. And there is, you know what, I find a little bit of sweetness on the palate too, or at least the perception of it, which is quite pleasant. I find a lot of Karwinskis tend to be a little drier and a little more bitter. And I think that has something to do with the fact that they tend to be a little higher in the cellulose because it is very stocky and hard. Like, for example, when producers produce a Karwinski in their mezcal and they make it into a mezcal, a lot of them struggle to break it down because you have once you cook the agave, you have to break it down, release some of the juices, and allow the sugar to be available for the yeast to consume. So you have to break it down. There's different methods of doing that by hand. But I've heard a lot of producers tend to like to use like a wood chipper because it is so hard to break down by other methods, even like a Tahona, for example, which is the big stone wheel. So because it's so high in that compound cellulose, maybe a little bit of that bitterness kind of shows up in the glass. But for example, with this one, I don't get it. It's very pleasant. There's a nice floralness to it as well. It's just like a very, very well-rounded mezcal. Like very, it's interesting and complex, and it's got some weird characteristics to it that maybe for like a beginner person getting into mezcal might be kind of like thrown off by. Like it's a little bit more of those savory and vegetal notes, but there is an approachability to it with a bit of that sweetness as well. It's very pretty. Delicious. Okay, so that's the copper pot. Now the next one, what's the Jolgorio? So this is the refrescadera still, right? So the difference being is it is still a copper pot. So it's still going to look very, very similar to other stills made from copper. The difference is it's going to have a contraption on the top that essentially will allow for 2 distillations to happen in one pass. So in a normal production method, maybe I can draw this out for us here. You'll have something like this. So the mezcal will be in here, or the Tobasiche, the undistilled version, will be here. It's getting heated up, rises. As it rises, it goes through here through a coil, and this will be filled with water, and that's what's condensing the vapor back down, right? However, with a refrescadera still, essentially what they do is around this little part here, this is what they call the montera, they'll put a little water jacket around it. And what that does is it causes reflux. It causes the condensation to happen before it even gets to the coil. And it concentrates it. So it's condensing, it's concentrating, falls back down, and then redistills again. So with normal copper pot distillation, it takes 2 goes to get it up to the proof that the Maestro Mescalero wants. So, usually anywhere from 45-55%. You can get a little bit lower sometimes, but generally that's the proof that they want it at. With the refrescadera still, they can do that in one go. And it's actually interesting. The reason why they call it the refrescadera, it's a refreshing still. Essentially what happens with that jacket is it sits there with the cold water in it, but as the distillate is coming up, it's going to slowly heat it up, right? And at a certain point, more and more of the vapor is going to get through to the coil and condense and finally come out as their final product. And when that happens, the ABV will start to drop. So as the producer, as the Maestro Mescalero is distilling, they're going to keep an eye on that ABV, because once it starts to drop and the water's starting to get a little too hot, what they're going to do is they're going to refresh the refrescadera part, the jacket, the cooling jacket around the montera, and they're going to dump out all that hot water and they're going to put in fresh cold water again, and it's going to re-up the process, and they're going to get it back up to the percentage that they like. When they do that, it's totally up to them, and it's going to have an effect on the final product. It's a much more efficient way of distilling, because you don't have to do one go, gather all your the commune, the first distillate, put it aside, restart up your fire, put it all back in again. You can just do it all in one go, in one sitting. so it's easier on like the firewood. You're not wasting any energy. But it's not a super common still, despite it being maybe a little bit more efficient. You generally will almost only see it in the south of Oaxaca. This is in Ejutla, which is in the south, but you'll also see it in Miahuatlan as well, where it's very famous too. But elsewhere in the rest of the state and pretty much even the rest of Mexico, you're not going to see this still. So it's very unique in that sense. They tend to be, just because of the region where they're coming from, they tend to be higher ABV. They tend to like their mezcal a little bit higher. This one's at 52%, which is getting up there. I mean, 55% is the tail end of what you can call mezcal. So a little bit higher proof. And I will say, you know, if you can think of it almost like the equivalent of a column still. The column still is the same kind of principle of getting reflux before it finally reaches out. You know, when you make the comparison between column and pot distillates rather, in any spirit, you know, you tend to find maybe that the column still may be a little cleaner. And I think that's generally the case here as well. Even if you're still only getting like 2 distillations in, I do find it's a little cleaner and brighter. But also, this is something that's interesting. Maybe some of that characteristic is coming from the actual terroir of the areas where Refrescadera stills are being used, specifically Miahuatlan and Ejutla, where you tend to see a lot of Karwinskis down there, and they tend to be very mineral driven, and it has a cleaner profile to it. But is that profile coming from the still, or is it coming from the agaves and the terroir that they're growing in, right? So it's a interesting question. It's a fascinating thing to think about, that we've only really kind of scratched the surface when it comes to mezcal, because we've got so much tradition. Which is amazing about mezcal, but there's so little we actually know about why certain things might actually have an effect on the final product. So doing stuff like this right now, like tonight, trying to parse out some differences is a interesting way to kind of, start to dive a little bit deeper and maybe push the category of mezcal a little bit further. A lot of producers do things for a particular reason, the only particular reason being because it's tradition, but maybe there's better ways to be doing things to get the product that they like. But anyways, side tangent. Let's talk about this one. So it's a Tobasiche. It's a different sub-varietal or subspecies of Karwinski. So not a Cuishe. And Pablo Vasquez. Okay. So this one is quite different. There is a earthiness that's coming from the Karwinski aspect of it, I would say, for sure. Like a little woody. It's a little stinky. It's got like a little stinky smoke. It's much more like the previous one I said was more high tone and bright. This one's much more like low tones. It's a lot of cooked agave. There's a distinctive like licorice and like black olive kind of note to it, but I do think it's simpler, for sure. Not in a bad way. Like the notes there are delicious, but it is a simpler mezcal. The cooked agave notes, they're pretty prominent. There's some caramel, a little chocolate, dulce de leche, black pepper. This is something I like to do. Your nose maybe is getting a little too accustomed to that one. Go back to the old one. So this is the Cuishe. And as soon as I'm already starting to pick up some new stuff on this, like the floral notes, the brightness, it's hitting like the top of my nostrils. There's a little bit more complexity to this one for sure. and it's bright and vibrant. Versus this one, yeah, it fills this like temporal space in my mind right now. Like this is much more low tone and brooding. It's a little bit more dessert like, but again, I think it's a little simpler. On the palate. The palate, there's a little bit more going on. I feel the alcohol in this one. The previous one, the Cuishe, was at 50%. This is 52%. Not that much of a difference, but I noticed the alcohol a little bit more on this one. It actually brightens up a little bit more on the palate. I'm getting more of the vegetal notes on this one, but it still has a lot of cooked agave. And I love the flavor of cooked agave, but you taste that in pretty much every mezcal for the most part. So as somebody that loves mezcal, you're always looking for something a little different, a little bit more of a nuance. It's tasty, like the cooked agave note's beautiful, but in comparison to the Cuishe that we just had, it's not as complex. There's not as much going on. But smoke's a little bit more apparent too. It's a little stinky. A kind of chemically kind of smoke. I like this mezcal, but maybe I should have done this one first, because the first one's just fantastic. Okay, and let's move over to the next one, which is our clay pot distillate. This is the stuff people like to obsess about with mezcal. Again, it's got that romanticism about it, these old handmade stills. People call it ancestral mezcal from the DO, and people automatically associate it like, oh, this is how mezcal was always made. It might not actually be the case. It's probably far more likely that the Spanish brought copper pot stills over, and those were what were initially used. But who knows? It's highly contentious about which stills were used first, when distilling happened in Mexico. You can do some research on that. It's an interesting subject. But yeah, so people love this because of that romanticism with it. It also, like, the clay pot distillates tend to be very exclusive batches because they're small. You can only make the clay pot so big. There tends to be a lot of waste in the sense that the clay will absorb some of the mezcal. It'll also leak a little bit. They tend to break, so you can lose whole batches sometimes because they're very delicate if you're not careful with how you're using them. And they will break eventually too, so you have to replace them often. And yeah, so the batches just tend to be very, very small. Like laughably small. Like the copper pot distillates that we're looking at, when you compare them to the world of spirits, where something like a Scotch produces like millions of gallons per year, for like some of the bigger guys. Even with the copper pot, sometimes they're making like 500, 600 liters per batch, and like for the whole year, like very little. But when you're talking about clay pot distillate, sometimes it's as low as like 50 liters for one batch. All that work, all cooking of agave, mashing, fermenting, all to go into a small 50-liter batch where you're going to get like 70 bottles out of it, right? So there's an exclusivity factor to it as well. Doesn't necessarily make a better mezcal. I don't like the idea of thinking that it's better or worse. I might have a preference these days for 100% copper distillates, but what I love about mezcal at the end of the day is the variety. So the fact that it exists and it's something to compare with copper, and there's all this variety in the category, I love that. But do I think it's better per se? No, it's just different, right? Yeah, so as I said before, this is Rosario Angelis in Santa Catarina, Minas. I don't think you can find this unless you go down to Mexico right now, unless you're very fortunate to find it. Karwinski as well. This is Tobasiche, so it should have a similar flavor profile to the previous one. And yeah, she's a woman producer, which is not the most common thing, which is pretty cool. We're starting to see a little bit more of it these days. It's becoming more acceptable. But yeah, let's dig into this one. And it's very different. Like, you could not mistake this for the previous two. And I do really think the method is showing up here. It is very mineral, intensely so. Crushed rock, chalk. I think of all of them, this one might have the most smoke, which might have to do with the production method as well. Because if you think about clay pot, it's going to be a little more porous than copper. Copper is going to, like, when you're heating up your still, when you've got firewood underneath with copper pot, it's going to completely seal it from that smoke, right? Versus something like clay pot, it's a little porous. It'll actually allow some of that smoke from the firewood to penetrate into the still. So maybe that's why it's the way it is. Again, there's so many factors. Maybe it's the way that she cooked her agave too, but I think this one has the most presence of smoke. It's the most rustic, for sure. And it's like distinctively like black olive and licorice. And it's brooding. Again, I like using this word brooding, but it's there's less of the high tones, but the complexity in what's going on right now is more than the previous one, I would say. There's green olive in it too. Dill. So those green notes from the Karwinski for sure. Very interesting. Very smoky on the palate. And the most robust of the three. Full bodied, very enveloping with the smoke. It's lots of the black licorice, black olive, cooked agave notes. Yeah, it fills my palate the most out of all of them. I still like the first one, the Cuishe copper pot, the best because I love those high notes. So again, let's go back to it. Can compare and contrast all of them. That's what I like doing. That's my favorite thing. Yeah, it's so bright and fresh, like, in comparison. And the smoke is just not there in the same way. Lots of citrus. There's kind of like this, not a bad way, but kind of pool toy kind of note. Like, you just get something really, like, yeah, just reminding me of, like, hanging out by the pool. Yeah, citrus, very citrus driven. And then versus Refrescadera. This one's interesting on the palate. I'm getting a little bit more from it now. More herbs. Oregano. A little bit. You know, kind of like a marijuana kind of note too. Piney. So yeah, very piney. And this one's it's the earthiest of all three of them. This one, earthy, rich, robust, a little stinky, and that mineral note too is the most, like, the earth and the mineral note is the most distinctive thing about this one versus the other two. So yeah, I mean, this is my personal preference. The copper pot, which, I think a lot of people might just see it as being very common and like more of a mass productive kind of process, is my favorite. I like those high tone, fresh notes. I feel like I can taste the the nuances of the agave, of the Karwinski itself, coming through a lot more. It's more distinctive in that sense, versus the other two, where I find this one's just more cooked agave and a little simpler. This one being the Refrescadera, and then this one being very earthy and very mineral, which I think is definitely coming from the clay pot. So, as much as people like to tout, don't get me wrong, this is delicious. Like, if I'm going to rate these, like, out of 100-point scale, it'd be something like 89, 84, 86, something like that. Like, they're very close. They're all very delicious, but this one just takes the cake for me because it's what I like. But an over predominance of people liking or saying that they like clay pot because of the prestige behind it, it's not. Don't buy into the the propaganda, so to speak, about these things. Find your palate, find what you like, and go with it and stick with it. But at the end of the day, what I said before, what's beautiful about these is how they're the same. We're talking about the same species. There are subspecies differences, Cuishe and Tobasiche, but they are the same species. But the differences between these three are quite stark. Like, comparing these two on the ends, they're miles apart. And the production method has everything to do with it, I think, at the end of the day. And it depends, what you're looking for in your mezcal. Like, I like the nature of the agave to come through. For me, coming from a little bit more of a wine world, where terroir and tasting the grape varietal is important, as opposed to too much production method. Like, you often hear, when you hear about winemakers and whatnot, it's like their only job is maybe to showcase what Mother Earth gave to them, sort of thing, not to put too much into the production method that it masks that, right? So maybe that's why I have a preference for the copper pot, because it shines a little bit more with the agave and maybe where it's coming from, the places and stuff, as opposed to clay pot, which might obfuscate the flavor of the agave a little bit more. It's fascinating, and it could complement the flavors of clay pot can complement the agave in really interesting ways, and can make a better spirit for sure, 100%. But it depends what you're looking for and what flavor profiles you like. So, but yeah, I mean, what did we learn tonight? What did I learn tonight? That I like clay or a copper pot a little bit more, and that, at least, I mean, I think the distinctions between these two, which are both at the end of the day going to be copper pot, just one being a slightly different method, that at least the distinction between the copper and the clay, grouping these two together as copper, is robust. There is a big difference for sure. And yeah, delicious mezcals nonetheless. So, I got a little bit left of these. I'm gonna let them sit for maybe 15-20 minutes, and I'm gonna come back to them. And but yeah, hope you found this informative. If you can find the Dixeebe, get it. It's a amazing mezcal. And yeah, have a good rest of your day.